It's a musical tribute to the CCC. And I wanted to share how excited I am because about a month and a half ago, an email went out to all the library community. I need ideas on programs. I need ideas on programs. And if 6 people said Bill Jamerson, 14 people said Bill Jamerson. So I'm so excited that we have him here because he's definitely spoken very highly of in the library community. And we'll let him get going here. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Well, I tell you what, how much I enjoyed firefighting. I never worked so hard in my life. First of all, your feet are always burning. Your hands are always hot. Your throat is burning with smoke. You stink like a pig. Your clothes always got singed. When I see these forest fires and the movies nowadays and all that there, and they have equipment to fight fires. We had a shovel.
Getting up in the morning out of your warm bed and hitting that cold air when you go out there to the bathhouse to wash up, I couldn't get adjusted to that. When you went on a project, you wasn't allowed to build a fire until you started to work, an hour after you started to work. Then you built a fire. That was the most difficult thing that ever happened to me. Then I realized I wasn't home, that I was at a CC camp.
You use what we call a spud bar, and you jab that into the ground, you pulled it back, jabbed it down again and pulled it back, you had a nice little square hole. You grabbed the tree, you snapped the roots down, pushed the roots on down, pulled the bar out, jammed it back about an inch back, pulled it on and pushed it forward. It was hard on those kids in Detroit that had never done any real physical work, but it made men out of them.
And we get up in the morning, go get our axes. They were sharp. New handles, no slivers. And I can remember I would always try to get my own axe, number 17. You didn't know what one you was going to get because he'd just pass them out in the morning when you went to get on the forestry truck to go to the woods. But I'd always say, number 17, Isaac. And I'd get my 17 if nobody else had got it first. I'll tell you, it's a lot of fun to work in the woods because it's just, you can see that you've done something.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bill Jamerson, and I hail from Escanaba, Michigan. And today we're going to talk about the Civilian Conservation Corps. I call this program Dollar a Day Boys, and it's great to be here in Janesville. What a beautiful community you have. I stumbled on this story 20 years ago. I was making documentary films for Michigan Public TV, and I discovered this footage of these young men planting trees. I asked my friend, holy smokes, those are the CCC boys, I said. And I called the museum up in Lansing. I said, did these fellows ever have reunions? And they do, up in Roscommon. And back in June of '92, I went to a CC reunion with 500 men there. I met a couple dozen. I shook their hands. They said it was the best year of my life. Turned my life around. Turned me from a boy to a man. And so I went on and made this film, and it's an hour-long documentary. It aired on 58 stations. Well, I went on to make 11 other films, but the CCs kept inviting me to their reunions and chapter meetings because I gave them some publicity, and they were very grateful. So I wrote some songs for them, and I'm going to share some of those songs with you today. And then 5 years ago, I wrote a novel about one of my friends who appeared in my video. And he became a very dear friend. He lived off of I-75, and I used to pick him up and take him to McDonald's. And this went on for 12 years. He had an iron trap memory full of stories. And after 12 years, I said, that's enough. I've got to write a book about you. So I did. So I'll read a couple excerpts from the book. This is a loosely structured talk. If you have any questions or comments, we'll ask these gentlemen to make comments if they are inclined. I always like to begin by asking, do we have anyone else out there who were in the seas? Yes, sir. Where were you in camp?
Camp Cavort, Leona, Wisconsin, Huber Story University of Rhinelander, Wisconsin, Eagle River, Three Lakes, Planting Beach, Fighting Fires, Building Roads,
Yes.
dynamiting,
Surveying
the Nicolay National Forest.
Surveying the Nicolay National Forest. Have we met before? I think I've seen you. We've met before somewhere. Lake Geneva, yes. I was at Lake Geneva last year. Oh, good. I'm so glad you came. Well, we're always looking for comments. And how did it change your life, sir?
Well, I don't know if it changed my life. I had a terrific life before that, after that, before.
Were you a farm boy?
Kind of.
Yeah. See, for the farm boys, it wasn't so tough because they were used to working 14, 15 hours a day already. And you come into the seas and you got off of work at 4 o'clock. You know, but it was the city boys it was tough on. Well, let's open up with a little song. This was written by a CC boy, Clive Kilgore, back in Nebraska, back in '37. And I love this song because it shows his gratitude, his heartfelt gratitude for the chance to be in the seas. From hills and plains throughout all the land, people are singing a joyful refrain, smiling and working, a merry youthful band, till happy days are here once again. With joyful voice, we all rejoice, for see, up to the skies our praises rise for our great country. We believe this land of the free is on the road to prosperity. Hip, hip, hooray for the NRA, Franklin D. and CCC. Hip, hip, hooray! Anyone else out there have family in the seas? Maybe an uncle or a dad out there? Yes?
I wasn't there, but I had two brothers in there.
Two brothers in the seas, okay.
Anything about Black River Falls, CC camp?
Black River Falls? No, I can't speak any specific about that area. They were crushing limestone in that area, I do know that. Providing limestone to farmers to sweeten the soil. They were building roads. Anyone else out there have family in the seas by chance? Any uncles or yes? You had a husband?
My father,
Your father?
Lieutenant George Burke,
Lieutenant George Burke. And where was he up at camp?
1880 was the number.
Is that up near Three Lakes, Eagle River? Yeah.
And Man River.
Well, let me talk a little bit about this for a moment because that's a good point. there's sometimes a little confusion. They were called the Civilian Conservation Corps because these young men were civilians. But they were in Army camps. How could that be? These were reserve Army officers that worked in the camps. So it was Mr. Smith, Mr. Jones. One fellow told me the first day at camp, the captain said, "Men, this could have been your dad." He said, "Men, I'm here because I needed a job. You're here because you needed a job. I'm going to show you respect, but I want some respect in return." It was March of '33, Franklin Roosevelt came into office with a promise of a New Deal for the American people. His first piece of legislation was the Emergency Conservation Works. This became known as the Civilian Conservation Corps. The idea was very simple. If you were between the ages of 17 and 25 years of age, you were a male, single, from a family on relief, in good health, and you weighed 108 pounds, you could sign up for the Seas. And boy, did they sign up. Over a 9-year period from 1933 to 1942, 2.6 million in 47 states enlisted. They were called enrollees, and these were voluntary young men. They volunteered to come into the camps. But there were also 450,000 VCCs. Now these were Veteran Conservation Corps camps, of which this woman's father was involved in. Now those were the older gentlemen. They were unemployed World War I veterans, so they were older, and they had different types of work programs. So nationwide, there were about 3 million. Here in Wisconsin, there were about 94,000 young men who participated in the Seas. And as I mentioned, they were civilians. Why? Because they didn't handle guns. There was no marching, no drilling. Otherwise, mothers would not let them sign up. So the camps were Army camps in every way, shape, and form. Army-issued clothing, mess kits, toilet kits, reveille at 6 a.m., dinner, curfew at 10 p.m. Everything was military about it, but there was no marching with guns. Now, the work projects were administered by federal agencies, the Park Service, the Forest Service, the Soil Conservation Service. Out west, the Department of Grazing. They were building roads, dams, bridges, planting trees. So depending on the work project, determined which federal agency was involved. The camps held about 200 men in every camp. And you saw in the video how they lived in these bunkhouses, long, narrow bunkhouses with a cot and a footlocker, just like the military. But they also employed local experienced men. They called them LEMs. These were welders, cooks, stonemasons, lumberjacks, carpenters, because they were out building buildings and dams and working in the woods. They needed supervision from people that had that background. And it paid these LEMs $40 a month, and they lived outside of camp. Now, $1 back then was worth a lot of money, $20 in today's money. You could buy an ice cream cone for a nickel, a dozen eggs for 7 cents, 5 gallons of gas for $1, new pair of shoes for $1.50. So that was a real lifeline to a lot of these people. Now, the CCs had a lot of nicknames. They were called Roosevelt's Tree Army, Soldiers of Poverty, which by the name is the name of a book that a woman named Mary Schuler wrote. It's a wonderful book, and it's probably here in your library. I've got a copy on the table out back. It's about her father's experience up in Mellon at Copper Falls State Park. They were also called the Soil Soldiers, the Boys in Green. I met a woman up in Door County. She said we called them the Crazy Khaki Kids. She used to write love letters to her girlfriend and put them underneath the stones at the entrance to Peninsula Park. And he'd have the truck driver get out and stop, and he'd run out and exchange love letters with his girlfriend. But my favorite nickname is Dollar a Day Boys. That's what they were paid, $30 a month. But the genius of the program was $25 was sent home to their families to help their mothers and dads and their brothers. And the stories they told me, paid the back taxes, paid my parents' mortgage, put my sister through teacher's college. But overwhelmingly, it put food on the table for a lot of people. And this is important to remember because a lot of people in the Depression were too proud to accept relief. You guys remember that. And they would rather starve. You go away, we don't want your money. You take our son to fight in your war. They didn't want to have it. But if they had a son out there building roads or planting trees, they took that money. And we'll never know how many people it kept from starving. The average CC boy had 6 to 7 dependents. So if you do the math, 3 million times 6 or 7, you're talking 18, 20 million dependents back home. It put food on the table. So the CC's was a relief program as much as it was a work program. I'll never forget a fellow coming up after my talk, and he shook my hand. I wasn't in the C's, but my brother was. That $25 a month put food on the table for my 11 brothers and sisters. Kept us alive. I'm telling you, kept us alive. I don't know what we would have done. He became very emotional. How did that money help your folks, Laverne?
Well, I had 6.
He had 6 brothers and sisters.
That was up there between Rhineland and Tomahawk.
And you, Ray, how'd the money help your family?
Well, like I say, my dad was a blacksmith, so he always had an income.
His dad was a blacksmith.
But he had a lot of farmers that couldn't pay.
That's right.
And put the money on, or put the bill on
Yep.
the books.
His dad was a blacksmith, so he had a lot of farmers who he did work for, put money on credit, and they never paid. And so that kept him going. It touched people in lots of ways. Hear that? He was 118 when he began. When he left camp, he was 135.
In boxing,
They kept moving him up. These guys, one fellow told me he grew 6 inches. A lot of them lied about their ages. Remember that? They'd use their brother's driver's license. They were 14 or 15. But they wanted to get out of town. They wanted 3 square meals. They sense of adventure. You know, a lot of these guys were hobos. They were living off the streets. It was a revelation for them to be around that much food. One of my CC friends told me he was from Chicago, and he was shipped up to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. He said, we were happy up there. There was no crime, no unemployment, no hunger. He said the woods around our camp was like a cocoon, protecting us from the outside world. He said his mother wrote him a letter, and she wrote how the neighbor had been evicted. Another neighbor had lost his job. His high school buddy was in jail. It was all bad news. He wrote her back and said, Mom, if you can't write anything nice, don't write at all. I don't want to hear about it. We were happy. And one reason they were happy was the food. You know, for breakfast, piles of pancakes and eggs and fried potatoes and ham. And for lunch, they brought out the stew. Remember the stew, fellas? 3, 4 leftover meats. You fill up your mess kit twice with stew and fresh baked bread sliced 2 inches thick. They only filled it up once. Someone told me they let you fill it up twice.
No, the things aren't quite that bad. They were very respectable.
Yeah.
They ate decent.
They ate decent food, but they had
Like you do at home.
they had a baker in every camp, you know, fresh baked bread and real butter. Remember that? And cookies, oatmeal, ginger, molasses, sugar cookies. Grab a handful of cookies. And for supper, they always started them off with soup. Do you remember that? You had your bowl of soup. I was up in Cloquet, and one fellow told me how this fellow came in. He was on his 3rd bowl of soup, just chowing down. How come you eating so much soup for? I'm hungry. Well, save some room for supper. I thought this was supper. Oh, no, we get dessert too. Well, what's dessert? He had never heard of dessert. Oh, my gosh. By the way, they used to buy the leftover produce from the farmers. And they'd drive in Saturday morning with their trucks of beets and cabbage and potatoes, and they'd just buy everything. They had big root cellars. You had 225 young men in these camps. That's a lot of hungry mouths to feed. And by the way, Mr. Farmer, on your way out, fill up your truck on us. Get yourself some oil and gas. You know, they won a lot of goodwill that way. And if a farmer hit a deer with his truck, well, bring it in. We'll give you $2 or $3 for it. One fellow used to drive in every few weeks with the deer in his truck. And my friend said, hey, there weren't any dents on his fender. Oh, there's a bullet hole. Yeah. They were just looking the other way. And they used to save their garbage for the pigs, for the farmers. I was talking to a fellow this morning. His name was Martin. He lives up in Fort Atkinson. He couldn't get a ride down here, so I gave him a call. And he told me there was this one farmer who used to come in, and he'd found a little fawn in his yard and raised it. He said he came in with a horse-drawn, he called it a bobsled in the winter. He'd pull this thing into camp. And he said the deer and the dog were following him as he came into camp. He'd take that old kitchen garbage and feed it to his pigs. Another fellow told me, he said, oh man, that garbage really helped my family. He said, I was just 15. I used to drive my dad's pickup truck and load up that garbage, and that got us through the Depression. And they knew how hungry we were. And if they had any leftover food, they'd put newspaper on top of the garbage and put extra food on top of it. He'd take the lid off the garbage can, and there'd be some biscuits or some meat. Oh, man, did that help us? That got us through. He got very emotional on me. These were very tough times, very tough. And people looked out for each other in those days. You remember that. They just did little things like that. I was in Ortonville, Minnesota. I asked one fellow last year, and he said, oh, Virginia baked ham. I had never had Virginia baked ham like that in my life. It was good food. Served American style. Now, they also had bakers in every camp. You had pudding, pie, cake. By the way, gals, if they burned the vanilla pudding, they called it butterscotch. I've been to 5 national reunions, and I remember meeting this fellow once. He said he was out in Idaho. He said, we had an old lumberjack baker. He made the most delicious cinnamon rolls. He said, one day I peeked in the back of the door, and I watched him as he was rolling the dough. He said, that old lumberjack had no teeth, and he chewed tobacco like this. And the tobacco juice was just dripping down his chin. He said, I never ate those cinnamon rolls again. Oh, brother. And then the fellow told me how one of the guys was eating cake. They used to bake these big sheet cakes. And, oh, there's raisins in this cake, fellas. Well, those weren't raisins. Those were cockroaches. Oh. The food was good. The food was plentiful. There were some complaints. I've run into stories. Some guys went on strike because they served them spaghetti for 2 weeks straight. Another camp, they went on strike because they served them beans every day. You had situations where there were cooks skimming, but generally speaking, as this gentleman in the back said, the food was plentiful and it was good. It was regular food. Nothing fancy, nothing fancy. Anyway, one fellow told me, he said, I felt like shouting hallelujah when I walked into that mess hall. I was so happy. So I said, that sounds like a song. And if you want to, you can join me on the chorus. The chorus goes, if my stomach could talk, it would shout hallelujah. Let's hear you. Come on. Hallelujah. There you, it's Sunday. We can get away with this, okay, Melissa? Way back in the Great Depression, my stomach was in a mild recession. Folks were poor. People were hungry. Couldn't get work all over the country. Well, Franklin D. built for you and me some work camps called the CCC. Put us to work, fed our bellies with lots of food like bread and jelly. Here we go. If my stomach could talk, it would shout hallelujah. If you ask me to walk, I'm gonna come running right to ya. 'Cause it's chow time. Goose eggs, duck eggs, hot on the griddle. What the farmer brings is always a riddle. We eat what's put in front of our face. It's chow time, give me a taste. Corned beef, roast beef, smothered in gravy. Piles of noodles, long and wavy. Turkey at Christmas, filled with stuffing. Apple pie, hot from the oven. If my stomach could talk, it would shout hallelujah. If you ask me to walk, I'm gonna come running right to ya, 'cause it's chow time. I know somebody's hungry out there. We've got lots of cookies afterwards, so stick around. Enlist for a year, we'll fatten you up. Your ma won't know you 'cause you're all filled out. When you eat, no talking at the table. Cook's got a knife, he's a bit unstable. Well, it's not gourmet, but 3 times a day, eat all you want. You don't have to pay. If it ain't moving, I'm digging in. No telling where this food's been. If my stomach could talk, it would shout hallelujah. If you ask me to walk, I'm gonna come running right to ya, 'cause it's chow time. Come and get it, boys. Now, when they first sent these fellows up to these North Woods, and by the way, 3/4 of the camps were north of Rhinelander. They were just everywhere. Crandon, Antigo, every little town, Eagle River, 3 Lakes. Most of them were up there because that's where the devastation had happened with the lumberjacks cutting down all the forests and the soil had gone bad. But when they first sent these fellows up there, they put them in tents, World War I Army tents. And they'd say, oh, we'll get you in a bunkhouse by the fall, and they normally did. But they were not always welcome by the locals. Put yourself in the shoes of a farmer. You know, you're out there struggling to make a living, and these well-fed, well-dressed young men are down there building a road. How come those guys are being paid $1 a day to build a road? This is my neighborhood. They're on the dole, and I'm not. You know, who do they think they are? The big city kids, these roughnecks. And I just lost 2 of my best farm hands to the CCs. And those CC boys, some of them got in a tussle with our local boys the other night in town and fighting over girls. It only takes a few bad apples to get word around in these small towns. So they were not always welcome in the beginning. But let me tell you the good news. What happened is when there were needs, they became good Samaritans. Who do you turn to when there's a fire, when there's a flood, if there was a blizzard? You got it. The CC boys were Johnny on the spot. They were ready to help. Up in Leona, a woman was stuck in a car. She was in labor, ready to have a baby, and trying to get to the hospital. She was stuck in a blizzard. The snowplows were stuck. Who do you call? Those roughneck CC boys. 80 of them went out with their shovels and got her to the hospital with a half hour to spare. Up in Eagle River, in 1 week, they saved the lives of 2 children from drowning. 2 separate incidents. A 3-year-old fell off a dam, and a young girl fell off a raft. In 1 week. That brought a lot of goodwill. I was in Hinckley, Minnesota 2 months ago. A woman told me how her 3-year-old brother wandered away from their home one night, and the mother was frantic. He wandered out in the woods. They couldn't find him. They called the CCs. 400 of them fanned out into the woods. They found him at 2:30 in the morning, 2 miles from home, in the woods, covered with mosquito bites. I can go on and on. You know, if there was an accident on the highway, they would send an ambulance out and pick them up and take them to the hospital. You know what I'm talking about. A lot of good deeds. So they won over the locals. And if you go through the old CC newspapers, you'll see the Majestic Theater welcomes CCC boys. You know, Elmer's Drugstore welcomes CCs. Of course, they spent their money, but they were also grateful for them, for the good deeds they were doing. I was up in Hayward, Wisconsin last summer and at the Lumberjack Museum, and there was a little CC display in the corner, and on the wall was a poem. And the name of the poem was Wood Ticks. And that was one of the bad nicknames they gave the CCs. One fellow told me, I've heard this from 2 different stories, that you'd be walking down the street with your shovels, going back to camp, and he said this German woman shoot her children in the door, then she turned on these guys and said, Wood ticks, wood ticks. How awful that must have been. You know, you're a fresh-faced little country guy from Indiana. What have I done, you know? So I took that poem and I turned it into a song. Because it shows what it was like from the point of view of a CCC boy. They call us lousy wood ticks who love to drink and fight, but it's where the CCs are when fires break out at night. We are the most unruly crowd the Lord has ever made, but when the flood breaks o'er the dam at CC, grab your spade. They say we drive our trucks too fast and make a lot of noise, but when some mishap comes their way, it's called the CC boys. They say we're non-supporting and on the relief rolls, but it's hello, Mr. CC man, when we vote at the polls. Oh, call me Cedar Savage, I don't pay it no mind. Call me a brush monkey, you'll never hear me whine. Call me a stump jumper, it won't bother me a bit. But when you call me wood tick, it puts me in a fit. Yep, just don't call me wood tick. They didn't like that at all. I remember giving a talk. A fellow in the back row raised his hand. He said, if it weren't for us CCs, Wisconsin would have blown away. It's hard to remember, but back in the old days, in the 1920s, that soil was going to seed up in the northern part of the state. The lumberjacks had cleared off the trees and taken out the stones. They had overfarmed the land, and they could not pay their taxes. The price of crops had gone down, and all across northern Wisconsin in the early 30s, people were walking, leaving their farms, and of course they were reverting back to the state. Well, what do you do with that sandy soil? The only thing that grows in it are trees, pine trees. There was a nursery up in Watersmeet, Michigan, where they ratcheted up production. They were producing 15 million seedlings a year, white pine, jack pine, spruce. And they would take those trees, and these young men would plant 1,000 to 1,500 trees a day. And that's where the Chequamegon and the Nicolet Forest came from. That's hard work. Hard work for the city boys. Farm boys could handle it pretty easily. They planted something like 260 million trees over those 9 years. They had something like a 94% survival rate on those trees, too. If they died, they'd replace them. If it was a dry summer, they'd go out and water them. They nurtured those trees. And they generated tremendous forests. The second biggest thing they did in the state were fighting forest fires. That's not such a big issue today, but back in the Depression, people were starting fires because the county paid you 15 cents an hour to fight the fire you started yesterday. Many of those fires were started delayed effect. The men would take broken glass, thick like Coca-Cola bottle glass, and they'd go out in the woods and prop it on a stick and angle it for the afternoon sun. And that'd give them a few hours to get home. The sun would cross the horizon, hit that glass, create a magnifying effect, and start a fire. And I can't tell you how many fellows told me, oh, we found broken glass out there. We knew they were starting those fires. And the stories they told me, oh, we had to jump in the river. The Crown fire went over our heads. Oh, we busted our buddies out with a Caterpillar tractor. And those bog fires up in Minnesota, they'd go out at night so they could see the embers glowing. You'd be shoveling those embers and you turn behind you. Oh, they're glowing behind you. And you turn around, they're all over. You're surrounded by embers. Miserable work. Miserable. Your eyes are burning. You can't breathe. But they did it. They did it. And they stuck it out. The ones that stuck it out, it turned them into men. It was rough work. Now, the CCs also repaired hundreds of miles of riverbanks. One of the legacies of the lumberjacks was they destroyed the riverbanks. Remember the log rolls? Every winter they stacked the logs, they would roll them down the rivers. Well, it destroyed the vegetation. So the rain washed the soil into the rivers, and that soil covered up the stones, the spawning grounds. When the CCs came in, they repaired the gullies, they put down riprap, they planted grass along the riverbanks. And then they put in hundreds of wing dams. There's a wonderful museum up in Rhinelander, a CCC museum at Pioneer Park, and they've got a book there. It's a blue book about an inch thick hardcover, Dams of the CCs, and it has illustrations of all these different dams. You know, some of the dams, these were below the surface of the water. They would speed up the flow of the water to wash the soil off the ground. Maybe they were to redirect the water flow away from the riverbank erosion. Maybe they were to develop little eddies for the fish to grow in. They had all kinds of dams. And then they had 7 or 8 fish hatcheries. And they put 500 million fingerlings in those rivers and restocked them. Probably the most physical legacy of the seas were the beautiful parks. Wyalusing, Devil's Lake, Copper Falls, Pattison, Peninsula, Rib Mountain, the lodges, the shelter buildings, the changing cabins, the bathhouses, these beautiful buildings. And of course, they worked with lumberjacks. When you see these lodges and these shelters at the state parks, if you look up at the timbers, those are hand-hewn timbers. Well, those weren't done by CCs. Those were done by lumberjacks with the old broadaxes. You can't take a 17-year-old out of Milwaukee, give him an axe and say, turn this log into a square timber. No, that's what the lumberjacks did. But the CCCs cut down the trees and they debarked them and they pulled them over and they hoisted them. They provided the muscle. Same way with the stones. When you go to these parks and you see the beautiful stone fireplaces, the CCs quarried the rock. They shaped the rock. They faced it. But it was stonemasons, artisans from the old country who built those beautiful chimneys and stonework. And at all those parks, they had carpentry shops where they built the benches and the park, the signage. They put in bubblers, which are the water fountains. They put in the hiking trails and planted shrubbery. What a great, great legacy they gave us with those parks. They also built over 2,200 miles of truck trails. I was talking with this gentleman this morning. He said he was up at 3 Lakes, and they to fight a fire in Phelps, they had to go south like 17 miles, then over, then up again. And so one of their jobs was to create, it became Highway 77 from 3 Lakes up to Phelps. And that was a truck trail. These were very simple truck trails, but it was to get to these fires. And of course, many of those truck trails became our county roads and highways today. And by the way, these teenagers were driving those Caterpillar tractors. These farm boys, they knew how to do it. And they were handling dynamite. They called them powder monkeys. I was in Verona last year, Viroqua, and a gentleman told me how we had a powder monkey. He didn't just blow up stumps. He could move that stump 2 feet to the left, 2 feet to the right. He was so good. And they had gravel pits. They were coating these roads with gravel. They also put up over 1,800 miles of telephone poles. I had a friend, his name was Johnny. He said, the sergeant called us over, okay, who wants to volunteer to climb the telephone pole first? He raised his hand. He said, I put the belt on and I put the crampons on my feet. And he said, I shimmied up that pole. And then I looked down and I realized I didn't know how to get down. He said, I shuffled the belt and took a step and whoo, he held on for dear life and slid down the pole. Well, the next 15 guys, they only climbed halfway up. They played it safe. And when they were all done, the sergeant said, Johnny, you're the new crew chief. But sir, I didn't even know how to. Doesn't matter. You knew how to save yourself. You used common sense. That's how you became a crew chief or crew leader in the CCs, right? Smarts, toughness, leadership. And when those guys went into the military, they shot up quickly in the ranks. If you don't believe me, this gentleman right here, Laverne, he said he was in the Army for 3 months. And what happened, Laverne?
I made sergeant.
He made sergeant.
Staff sergeant a couple months.
Staff sergeant, boom.
And when it came in from these new draftees,
Right.
someone would be crying. In fact, the first time I was in basic training, first day, that night, one of the guys shot himself, killed himself in the fire because he was so homesick. But you've never seen any CC guys homesick.
Yeah, when these guys came into the Army, they were homesick. The CCCs were tough. The CC guys got out their homesickness when they came into camp. By the way, they did cry in the seas, though. They got it out of their system. Yeah, I know a lot of these guys told me, and I asked one fellow once, I said, did they really cry? He said, I did. They missed their mothers. That's all they knew. And they were away from home. I met a woman up in Neenah. She told me that her brother was in the seas, and he wrote home and he begged for someone in the family to come visit. And for some reason, her dad couldn't. She said, I was just 14 years old, and I didn't have a driver's license, but I borrowed my dad's truck. She said, I could barely see over the steering wheel, and my brother drew me a map. He was just 35 miles away, and she drove out on a Saturday morning and picked him up for lunch and took him out to lunch. And she said, as I told him stories about the family back home, tears were coming down his cheeks. Yeah, they missed their families. Some of these guys, went over the hill. It was called absent without leave. Remember that? Maybe AWOL. 2 to 5% of them couldn't take the hard work. and you'd hitch your ride home, jump on a freight train. You were allowed to leave. It was called an administrative discharge. But if you did go home, the captain would send a telegram to your family and say, we do have a train ticket for your son. He is welcome back, but he will be punished. And many of them did come back. Yeah. But it was a rude awakening. I remember a woman told me how over in Whitewater last year, she said she was in her car with her mother, and they were driving down the road, and they saw a woodchuck on the side of the road, and her mother pulled off, took a gun out of the trunk, and shot the woodchuck, and they had it for dinner that night. And people lived off the land. You know, relief in those days, just a really quick review, was for mothers with children. If you were a single man, there was no such thing as relief. No such thing. If you were a mother, you'd take your wagon down to the relief building. If they had one in your town, only the bigger towns had them. The county had them. And they'd give you a sack of flour and some dried apples, some sugar, a can of lard, some government cheese, and then you were on your way. If you want some fresh vegetables, you went out and had a garden or climbed a tree for apples.
And these women, if they had too much sugar and not enough flour, the neighbor women would trade.
The women would trade, yeah. It was a very rough period for a lot of people.
My mother used to put stuff out to the hobos, well, then they'd mark the tree, of course, and then she had all kind of hobos.
Yeah, that's right. They would mark the trees of that this person was, have good language, so they're Christians, or these people are good for a sandwich or good for a bath. They had little language. Oh, the things the CCs did. There's so many of them, just too many. They did timber stand improvement. They cleared out thousands of acres of junk trees. They cleared underneath power lines. They built fire breaks on the sides of the roads. All kinds of projects. Well, there's a saying in camp that life began at 4 o'clock. And that meant time to go back to camp at 4 in the afternoon. And you had about an hour and a half before dinner time. And that's time to go to play some baseball, boxing, basketball, shoot some pool up at the rec building, maybe a game of horseshoes with your buddies. They liked to play chess and checkers. They played poker. They had a lot of angles for making money. You could get a haircut for 10 cents. The fashion of the day were bell bottoms. Remember that, fellas? They'd slice. There's always someone for 15 cents. He'd slice your pants from the knee down and sew a piece of fabric in and turn your pants into bell bottoms. By the way, gals, I asked a fellow once, I said, if your girlfriend asked you to steal something in camp, what would it be? Oh, that's easy, a flour sack. Their girlfriends always wanted flour sacks because they would make clothes out of those. The second most popular was sugar. One fellow made money by writing love letters to guys' girlfriends. He had beautiful penmanship and flowery language. He said, one time I wrote the same letter to 3 girls who lived in the same town. Yeah, they happened to be best friends. It didn't work out so good. One fellow who was kind of clever, he made a beehive. He made a beehive out of wood, and there's a little latch door, and for a nickel, you could peek inside. And he wrote on the outside, there was a little sign, rare albino bees. Well, what he did, he had carved out all these letter B's and painted them white. Of course, nobody told the next guy because nobody wanted to give up the secret, But now every camp had mascots: deer, dogs, fox, raccoons, flying squirrels, crows. My favorite mascot was Pete the deer up at 3 Lakes. And if you saw my poster in the hallway, it showed the cook holding the legs of this big buck, and that was Pete. Well, they found Pete in the woods with a broken leg, and the doctor set the leg, and they created a harness, and after 5 or 6 weeks, it healed up. They nursed him back to health, and when they let Pete go, he wouldn't go. He was so domesticated, he stayed around camp. And he would go up to the kitchen every night and clack its hooves on the steps, demanding his evening supper. Sometimes he'd push his way in the screen door in the kitchen and eat the food right off the counter. But my favorite Pete story is he would let himself in the screen door of the bunkhouse, and if the boys were sleeping with their toes sticking out under the blankets, Pete would lick their toes. Oh, yeah. All kinds of stories. And every camp had garbage pits, and those bears used to hang around. And for fun, the guys would put a little molasses in a pail. And the bears would come along and get their heads stuck in the pail. And there'd be 3 or 4 guys with broomsticks waiting to swat the bears behind. And if you don't believe me, that's in the video that's for sale in the back counter, yeah. You can also find the video on Interlibrary alone. But, oh, they had lots of fun. There was a lot of practical joking. They'd send guys looking for left-handed monkey wrenches and sky hooks and pole stretchers. Hey, rookie, get over here. Yeah, the sergeant's looking for the striped paint. Striped paint? What's that? Don't ask questions. Just get over to the garage and find it. You guys seen the striped paint? Well, it was around here a few minutes ago. Why don't you go check the equipment building? Hey, you guys seen the striped paint anywhere? Well, I think I saw it at the supply shack. Back and forth for hours. Pole stretchers, sky hooks, tree squeaks. Anyway, one fellow told me they were boiling big pots of water, dipping chickens in it to loosen their feathers in the kitchen. And the cook told him to take that dirty hot water and dump it in the garbage pit. Well, he did. He dumped it without looking right on a baby bear cub. So he told me a story, and I made a little song out of it called City Slicker. One day a boy was hauling hot water in a pail. He dumped it in a garbage pit right on a bear cub's tail. That baby bear made a shriek that made that boy's eyes wide. Across the pit he saw the mother on the other side. That mother bear growled so loud it made that young man cringe. He ran on back to camp so fast the door fell off its hinge. Yeah, the mama bear put a shock in his life. Well, he ran in the kitchen so fast the screen door fell off its hinge. Late at night, some dogs chased some boys up a tree. They stayed up in the branches wondering how they'd all get free. In the morning, a local farmer came to their rescue. He was searching for his hunting dogs, led by a hound named Blue. Those boys were so embarrassed they had stayed up all the night, running from some friendly dogs that did not want to bite. Yeah, it was a hot summer night. 3 guys snuck out for a swim in the creek. But walking back, they got chased by the neighbor's dogs. And they thought those were wolves. So they spent the whole night up in the trees. One day a CC boy went rabbit hunting with his gun. He was told to look out for a wild boar on the run. As fate would have, he saw that boar and put it in his sight. A single shot took down the beast, they cooked it up that night. A farmer came looking for his pig that had run away. The boys collected some money, paid the farmer that day. That wasn't a wild boar. He shot the neighbor's pig. They took up a collection, $4, and gave him a blueberry pie and sent him on his way with a smile. Come on, all you CC boys, join us in the woods. We'd love to give you company, oh yes, we surely would. We don't care where you have come from, we don't care where you have been. When you come into our forest home, your troubles will begin. Why'd they put up with that hard work? Fighting fires. Working out in the cold. By the way, they had a rule in camp. You didn't have to work if it was 20 below. One fellow told me how the thermometer was rigged in his camp. He said it only went to 19 below. It would just quiver at 19 below. We knew that thing was rigged. Yeah. One fellow told me they were celebrating one day. It was 20 below. No work. Hooray. Where the sergeant came in. Oh, no, it's got to be 21 below. Well, who went on strike? Yeah, you got it. But they didn't get their lunch or supper that day. It was tough. And how about working in those bug-infested swamps? I'll never forget the fellow who was hanging telephone wires up in the Minnesota swamps. He said the black flies were eating them alive. Where do you run when you're on a telephone pole? Tell me. No. Well, the doctor in camp came up with the solution. He mixes black tar substance with citronella. And the guys rubbed it on their arms and faces. They were all black-faced. It was just a mess. But he said it worked. The only problem was we were like fly paper. the flies would come and stick on your face and they couldn't get off. And they'd walk across and tickle your nose. He said we couldn't pick them off because we were hanging telephone wires. Our hands would get all greasy. It was miserable. They worked in the cold and the bug-infested swamps and the fire. Why do they stick it out? Because the money was going home to their families. They were helping their brothers and sisters. They may have joined for a sense of adventure. They may have joined to get out of town or for 3 square meals. But the reason they stuck it out, the guys that did stick it out, it was helping the folks. It's not easy doing night patrol at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's not easy planting those trees all day and building roads. These guys would get letters from home and sometimes they would cry. My friend told me how, the reason I wrote this book was because I couldn't believe these stories he told me, so I just had to put them in a book. He walked into the bunkhouse one day and his 20-year-old pal, Jose, a Mexican youth from Detroit, was crying. What are you crying for, Jose? And he sniffled and he motioned his head like this, and there was a letter. Oh, you want me to read the letter? So he picks up the letter. Dear Jose, we're so proud of you and the fine job you're doing. Your last paycheck helped us buy lots of food like beans and cornmeal and sugar. The pantry's so full you wouldn't recognize it. Mama spends a lot of time in the kitchen singing. She's so happy. There was enough money left over from your last check to buy your sister a new Easter dress, a pair of shoes, and an Easter bonnet. I wish you could have seen how pretty she looked at church. We thought of you that day. I'm going to skip ahead here because he's trying to guess why he's crying. Oh, I know. You're sad because there wasn't enough money for your parents to buy anything nice for themselves. Jose nodded. He wanted his parents to have something nice other than flour and sugar. Yeah, that's why these guys stuck it out. Yes?
My mother said that you could fill the back seat of a car for $15 groceries.
His mother said you could fill the back seat of a car for $15 in groceries. $25 a month, that's $500 in today's money. That did a whole world of good for people. And a lot of those people, again, were too proud to be on relief.
You could buy a new Chevrolet for $750.
Well, yeah, but a lot of these guys bought used Chevrolets for $75 too, yeah. Now, at 6 o'clock, 10 minutes to 6, they went to the bathhouse. Remember that, fellas? You'd wash up, put on your uniform. By the way, these guys, when they came into camp, some of them threw their clothes away. They were in rags. Because they were issued new dungarees, those are blue jeans, socks, underwear, shoes, boots. I met a fellow in Georgia a few years ago. He said, when I showed up at the bus stop to go into the seas, all of us were barefoot. None of us owned a pair of shoes. They had khaki uniforms in the summer and ties and caps. In the winter, they had those forest green wool outfits, remember that? Hats, sweaters, overcoats, all new clothes. I was in Hayward, Iowa, just 2 months ago. I visited a CC at his home, Whitey Iverson. Well, when I went to the seas, I thought I was checking into a high-class hotel. Running water, indoor plumbing, electricity. And what's that under my blanket? Well, that's a sheet. Well, what's a sheet? What's that for? These guys came from very humble backgrounds. They were very grateful to have those clothes. But anyway, so after they had their dinner at night, they kept their uniforms on and they went up to classes. 15 to 20% earned their 8th grade diplomas. You have to remember, a lot of those guys dropped out of school to help their families. Well, my dad took me out of school at 15 to work in a scrapyard. Well, my dad kept me on the farm harvesting potatoes, and I was 3 weeks late in going to school, and I never got caught up, so I dropped out. Or I had to take care of my siblings. So it gave them a second chance. And of course, a lot of guys dropped out because I hated school. But they had grown up, they had matured. So they brought in teachers. On Monday night, you had an English, history. Tuesday would be geography and science. And by the way, those questions were like high school exam questions today. They were tough. Here's a math question. A load of wheat, if a load of wheat weighs 3,942 pounds, what is its worth at 50 cents a bushel, deducting 1,050 pounds for tare? And they did not have calculators in those days. U.S. history. Name the events connected with the following dates: 1607, 1620, 1800, 1849. These were tough questions. Now, if you didn't take your 8th grade diploma classes, you could take correspondence courses. Accounting, business, forestry. These were developed by the University of Wisconsin. And if that wasn't enough, they had vocational courses: welding, engine repair, carpentry. Do you remember those things they offered? Kept them busy at night, kept them busy. And if that wasn't enough, they had ham radio clubs, photography clubs. Sometimes you'd have a musical group, swing band. And every camp had a newspaper. Remember your camp newspaper? And every camp newspaper had a humor section. I love the humor. Here's typical there. A lot of these jokes were revolved around women for obvious reasons. Betty says, "I hope everyone notices my new hat." Belinda, "Then you had better lower your skirt 6 inches. How about this? A city girl staying in the country became friendly with a young farmer. One evening, as they were strolling across the field, they saw a cow and her calf rubbing noses in an affectionate fashion. "Ah," sighed the farmer sheepishly, "that makes me want to do the same." "Well, why not?" said the girl. "It's your cow, isn't it?" Here's a quickie. How is a small boy similar to a canoe? They both behave better when paddled from the rear. Oh, you bet. Now, I've got to speed this up a little bit. They were off. They had Saturday morning camp cleanup and inspection just before lunch. Remember that? And they were free after lunch until 10 p.m. Sunday night, curfew. And if you're in good behavior, typically you were allowed to go into town. If you lived close to home, you could go home to see your folks. They loved to go into town to see go to the movie theater, the roller skating rinks, the bowling alleys. They went to the saloons. They loved to go to the movies. Oh, that was a real big treat. And they loved to meet the girls. And of course, the girls liked to meet them too. The dads would tell their daughters, "Stay away from those CC boys." But what happens when you tell your daughter not to date someone? Yeah, why not, One woman told me she put a ladder up to her second floor bedroom window and snuck out and went to the dance hall with the CCs. She came home at 3 o'clock in the morning and the ladder was gone. Her father was waiting up for her. One fellow told me, he said, you'd be sitting in a movie theater, there'd be a kicking on the back of your chair. "Hey guys, you want to share our popcorn with us?" Another told me how she and her girlfriends would wait outside on the sidewalk outside of the movie theater and wait for the CCs to drive up. And then they would pair up with them and go in the theater and hold hands with them. I said, "That's it?" She said, "Yeah, they just wanted to hold our hands." Isn't that sweet? Now, many of these towns never had dance halls until the CCs came to town, but they'd take an empty church, an empty city hall building, town hall building, and they would turn it into a dance hall for Saturday night. A woman up in Madison told me how, I'd go to the dance hall with my girlfriends on Saturday, and we would pair up with each other. We'd be on the dance floor, and the CC boys, they would line up against the wall. And they would make little hand signals and say, "Hey, can me and my buddy cut in on you two girls, across the floor," right? And the girls would kind of check them out. "What do you think, Agnes?" "Well, Betty, I like the tall one." "What do you think, "Okay, let's give it a try." Then they'd nod, and those guys would come across the floor and cut in on them. So it was very, very discreet. So if they turned them down there, nobody was embarrassed, okay? But they had ways to meet the guys. And the guys had to be smart to meet the girls. One time these fellows were planting trees, and in the farm field next door, a young lady was shooting bows and arrows into bales of hay. Well, one of the guys went over during his break and asked her out to the movie. "Oh, my dad won't let me go out with CCs." "Yeah, but what if we happen to show up at the same movie on the same night? What if we happen to sit next to each other?" He wrangled himself a date. You had to be smart. It was very competitive. One fellow who had to drive into town every day to pick up the mail told me He said, I used to time my route to go by the high school when the girls were getting out. He said, I'd pull up to the curb and roll down the window. I had my uniform on and, hey, girls, you know, and chat with them. Well, he found out where one young lady went to church. Well, guess who started to go to church on Sunday? Yeah, that's how he met his wife. Yep. You had to be aggressive. You had to be smart. I think one woman said it best. She said, I'll never forget, I was at an ice skating rink, and there were 3 CCC boys trying to tie my skates at the same time. Yeah. I was in Curtis, Michigan just a couple months ago, and a woman said, every marriageable age girl in my town married a CC boy. Why not? You know, who are you going to date? You got a couple dozen local hayseeds or 400 CC boys out there, you know, who got some meat on their bones, they got some good clothing on their back, a little jingle in their pocket, you know, and so they dated them, and they liked them. Well, there were a lot of reasons why the CCs were life-changing experience for these men, why the Corps was. I think number one, if you look back on why it changed their lives, it had to be the food. 3 square meals. You know, when you're a teenager and you're hungry, you're ornery. But when you're 20, 30 pounds underweight, you know, you can talk all you want, but that guy needs food. And it gave him food and lots of it. Like Laverne said, he put on 20 pounds in the camps. I heard that over and over. And that food calms him down. Number 2, some of these guys came in from the cities with a chip on their shoulder. They were angry at the world. You know, they were unemployed. They had no money. They're bitter. Why were we born at this time? Well, you give them hard work. You give them an axe. Give them a shovel. Put them to work. Work that aggression out. So hard work was another key. Number 3, 8 hours of sleep. When the lights went off at 10 o'clock, did they have to ask you twice, Ray, to go to bed? No, they were out. They got 8 hours of sleep. They needed that rest. Number 4, the Good Samaritan deeds they did. You know, helping people in floods and blizzards, rescuing children in the woods. It taught them to see beyond themselves. And a lot of good effect of that. Number 5, good role models. In my book, I tell lots of stories how they developed relationships with these local experienced men, with the officers. They took them under their wings, gave them direction. A lot of these fellows came into camps, they had no dads. The dads had taken off looking for work. Many of them had never come back. Last but not least, when you're broke, when your pockets are empty, you don't feel good about yourself. And a lot of these guys never had 2 nickels in their life before they joined the CCCs. So it gave them some self-esteem, gave them something to look forward to. But those half-dozen things changed their lives. You know, when they came into camp, they were slump-shouldered, kicking the ground, bad language, poor table manners. You know, Laverne talked about how when these Milwaukee guys came into camp, the first time they were so undernourished, they would just grab food with their hands. They were sloppy and messy. The cook had to come out and lecture them. You don't have to eat so fast. You know, the food's not going to run away. You know, use a fork. Calm them down. But a lot of these guys, it changed their lives. When they came out of camp, their shoulders were straight. Their clothes were nice. They had a shine on their shoe. Yes, sir. No, sir. Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. They took their caps off when they greeted a woman on the street. It turned them into men. And the private employers out there wanted to hire them because they knew they were good workers. They knew they had good habits. It changed their lives. And so what was their reward for 4 years in the military? I'm sorry, a year in the CCs, 4 years in the military, in the Navy, in the Marines, in the Army. I'll never forget a guy who came up after one of my talks. He gripped my hand with a vice grip. You know, I was a Marine. Half the Marines were CCs. It's why we won the war. It toughened us up. We don't want to forget that. Is that true, Ray? You bet it is. Give credit where credit is due. It toughened those men up. And after the war, they came, they were great dads and great husbands. And they led good and noble lives. And by the way, a lot of these fellows were involved in the environmental movement in the 70s. They were on the city councils, the county commissions. They were overseeing cleaning up rivers and putting out those open pit dumps the cities used to have back in the 70s. Yeah, we don't hear much about it. But they left their mark on the land. They reforested, they planted 3 billion trees nationwide, thousands of miles of truck trails, hundreds and hundreds of state parks and national parks. All these wonderful things. And this year is the 80th anniversary, and we're saluting these 3 gentlemen today. I think one woman said it best, though. She came up after my program. She said, you know, she said, the greatest thing the CCCs did for America was give us a lot of great husbands. Is that true? Yeah. Let's hear for these 3 guys here today. Do we have any questions out there before we break up? Yes.
We were waiting for the library to open. A young man came over to our car and wanted to know if we had some money for him. He was just recently out of jail, he said, and he needed some more clothes. I recommended he went to the Salvation Army because I knew that they would give him more than just a shirt. He wanted a shirt. But I was thinking at that time, wouldn't it be nice if we had a program like this for this young man? He needs, granted he did something wrong to be in jail, but we got to give him a chance now that he's out.
Yeah.
And I think this system with the boys, there are a lot of them, he said he had tried all over trying to find a job. Well, because he's been in jail, people don't want to hire him. So it would be nice if they could have some kind of a program today for these young men.
Well, the CCCs would work today on 2 conditions. It has to be run by the Army, number 1. Number 2, it has to be compulsory. In other words, it can't be volunteer. These guys wanted to work 80 years ago. Today's young men don't want to work. The number of young men, able-bodied men on food stamps today has grown from 1.7 million to 4.5 million under our current president. These are able-bodied men. And by the way, the Republicans want to cut that out of the food stamps. They want to say no more able-bodied men should get food stamps anymore because there's no incentive to work if you get free food. And so it would, if the CCCs were around today, it would have to be compulsory. Rich or poor, white or black, 1 year. When you're 18 years old, you go into those work camps, give them a shovel, put them out in the mountains, teach them how to work. Because we have a large generation of young people that refuse to work. And I talk to people from these Job Corps centers, and there are Job Corps places. By the way, that's what you tell young people, Job Corps. It gives these young people a chance. It's like a CC camp, but they teach them electrical work, bricklaying, and stone. And it's a wonderful program. But the Job Corps people tell me they go out and recruit. They'll recruit 50 people at a couple schools, and only 5 will show up. And they'll pay them $10 an hour. So, yeah, it's a real problem. It's a real challenge. I don't know if our politicians have the backbone to do it.
Let them go hungry then.
Yeah, that's right. Funny things happen when you're hungry. You learn to work. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? By the way, for those of you who are doing any research, there is a website called ccclegacy.com. And you go on the website, and it can tell you where the camps are located in the state. If you want to get your papers, your discharge papers, there's a woman, her name's Ashley Mattingly. I've got her phone number. I can give it to you in St. Louis, Missouri. She'll send you your discharge papers and medical reports, all kinds of things about your uncle or granddad. By the way, if you know someone who would enjoy these stories who wasn't here today, I do have some books, a half dozen on the table back there for sale. They're normally $20. Today they're only $15. Chock full of great stories. It's a year in the life of my friend. And I also have some videos back there and some CDs of songs for $5. These songs, a dozen songs that I wrote about the CCs. I also have some postcards back there, which if you want to give to your brother in Brainerd or your sister in Peoria, say, give this to your library or give this to your historical society. I appreciate any references, and that's often how I will get work. And feel free to take a look. There's some discharge papers and some photo albums back there you can look at and reminisce over. And by the way, I know these gentlemen, Ray, Laverne, and the gentleman back here would be happy to answer any questions if any of you have any. And Melissa, again, thank you so much for hosting me today. Don't forget the cookies on the table, the cookies and coffee. Compliments of the library. So again, thank you for coming out on this beautiful afternoon.